Hey, what is up, my fam? Thank you for tuning in back to my channel. My name is Buddy Steele, and this is Plug Talk. So, I am really thrilled to be debuting this to you guys. So, for a while now, I've been wanting to incorporate some history into my channel. I have always been a big history buff, particularly U.S. history. But how do you do it in a way that is compelling and that is entertaining for the audience? I don't know if I accomplished that with this video that I've recorded, but what I'm planning on doing is not really once a week. Occasionally, what I'm going to be doing is a special where I'm going to be highlighting someone that I admire, someone that resonates with me for what they've accomplished, who they are, what they're about. And give you a little bit of background on them as well and why they resonate with me. And I'm going to be calling it Highlighting My Heroes. And so this is going to be entry 1 into highlighting my heroes. So I am very excited to debut to you my first hero, and that is President Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. Alright guys, before we get started, please hit that like button. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. It is time to plug in. Let's get it. So, Teddy Roosevelt was born in October of 1858 to a big family, and quite a well-to-do family as well. His father and mother had quite a bit of money, and they were pretty highly regarded in New York. They had a mansion right in the middle of the city. Teddy actually, when he was 7 years old, witnessed Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession going down the street from their mansion right there in the middle of the city. But Teddy, he was definitely, contrary to what you might think, he was not the golden child of the family. From the get-go, Teddy Roosevelt was a very sickly child. He had debilitating asthma. He was always sick. He had severe nearsightedness. He actually had to sleep sitting up throughout his childhood so he wouldn't stop breathing while he was sleeping. He had a lot of issues. His dad told him early on, "Son, you have the mind, but you do not have the body. You've got to build up your body." His doctor had told Teddy that, hey, you need to live a very sedentary lifestyle. Your heart is not going to be able to handle you living a strenuous life. Teddy did not follow those directions. He actually lived by the motto of living a strenuous life and always striving for more and doing more and pushing yourself to the limits. And, that was a markedly change in his attitude early on. Roosevelt was, really determined despite him always being sickly. He fought that back. He was very energetic and athletic. He was always outdoors. And from very early on, you could tell that he was really curious. He was always reading books. He was always out in the wilderness looking at insects, studying animals. By the time he was like 15 or 16, he was a veteran taxidermist. You could really consider him a biologist. He had written a book when he was 11 years old, The Natural History of Insects. He kept pets in his house and bugs in his house and would, raise them and take care of them. When he would hunt, he would take the animals back inside and dissect them and study them and take notes on them. Definitely not a normal kid. He was quite ambitious. So he was successful in high school and he went off to college. He went on to Harvard. He was quite successful there. He was an athlete. He was on the intramural boxing in the league there. Was in the championship bout, I believe. The dude was just successful everywhere he went, but it wasn't because of his natural ability. It was because of his hard work and perseverance to follow through and finish. He finished magna cum laude at his school. He was the editor of the paper there. And because that's not prestigious enough to graduate from Harvard top of your class, he also found the time to write his first book that was published, The Naval War of 1812. He had a big fascination with the Navy and ships. in the water. And that was something that was going to aid him very well later on in his political life. And that book that he wrote while at Harvard is still a book that is widely cited today and really is like the standard of war books, not just Navy books, but war books in general. So after he graduated from Harvard, he went on to law school at Columbia. While at school there, he had decided that he wanted to enter a life of politics and really didn't get what he wanted to out of college. Didn't feel like he was getting the return on his investment, his time investment. And so he actually dropped out and he started for a life in politics. And he quickly got immersed into politics. He was not well liked in his circle of politicians in New York, but he quickly gained respect because he was honest, he was hardworking, and he was smart. He was very, very capable. And eventually, he was the top dog as far as the electorates go there in the local New York. But he had lost an election late in his young career there. I believe it was for mayor. And he thought his political career was over. So now he was really considering what he wanted to do. Should he go back to law school? He really wasn't sure. He had heard about these ranchers that were making a lot of money raising cattle over in the West. So this is when the West, the Manifest Destiny, where Thomas Jefferson had, purchased all of that land from France. Well, it was now getting migrated, and they were making a lot of money raising these cattle and livestock. And, Teddy Roosevelt, being always enamored and appealed to, the outdoors and the wildlife, he took a little bit of money he had, and he bought some land over in the Dakotas and bought some cattle and started that business there. Naturally, he did not gain respect initially by the other cowboys in that area. They called him Tenderfoot because he was small and he was a city boy, but he definitely earned their respect because of his hard work. He actually chased thieves around. They were, I think they were cattle thieves or horse thieves. He chased them for 2 weeks, and there were 4 of them, and he eventually caught them after 2 weeks. That is a true story. So he demanded respect from everybody around him, and he became a very accomplished horse rider as well. And he went on to write a book about his time in the West, which really gained some insight for the people over on the East Side in the city on what the life was like over on the West Side. And I'm sure that had a big influence on why more people migrated over there. So at this time, after he'd been a cattle rancher for quite a while, he was an accomplished horseback rider. The Spanish-American War had just kicked off, and he wanted to serve. So with his knowledge in politics of the naval background and his a little bit of knowledge with guns and infantry skills and stuff, he went in and enlisted. He ended up being a lieutenant colonel, and he led a group of infantrymen and men on horseback right to the front lines of a huge battle where they were big time underdogs. I mean, there was no chance that they were going to get out of there alive. They were so outnumbered. They didn't have like the weapons and, all of the equipment to be able to match up with them. And Teddy Roosevelt would later say that the only way that he could lead his men to go up in the front lines in such an outnumbered battle and such likelihood of failure and death, the only way that he could lead them to do something as crazy as that is to lead from the front side. And he had a horse for a while, but his horse actually got tangled in some barbed wire. And so he went on the front lines on foot and ran through trenches and ran through the battle lines. And he returned a war hero. And I mean, when he returned back to New York, no one could ever hold it against him that he came from a rich and well-to-do family, because he had always identified more with the everyday Westerner commoner, and he had earned that moniker as well. So after some time returning to New York, he was back in politics. He did have a better reputation, and people just gravitated towards him, especially the public. People inside his circle in politics and his offices, they did not like him very much because he was such an honest dude. There was a lot of corruption going on in New York politics at that time, and he was having none of it. He regulated trusts, and, he ended a lot of collusion that was going on within his own party. But he still was popular enough to win the role of governor of New York. As governor of New York, this dude did not just talk about it. He was about it. He had worked as a president of the Board of Police Commissioners for just a short time before becoming governor. And at that time, man, the police in New York were not respected. They were very corrupted, with the criminals of the area. There was a ton of crime going on. The cops, were not working on the job. And he made sure to put an end to that. He was known for walking out in the middle of the night in commoner clothes just to try to catch one of his officers sleeping on the job or doing something, that wouldn't be respected as an officer. He, by the end of his tenure as the president, they were one of the most respected police forces in America on how they had turned that city around. So, over time, as governor of New York, everyone else around him was getting so sick of him, busting all these trusts and getting in the way of all these, crooked politicians making money that, they wanted to find a way to get Teddy out of their noses and get rid of him. They didn't know how. So, it ended up happening that William McKinley was running for president. The only way that they could think of getting Teddy out of there was to have him be his running mate as vice president, because it's a pretty, inconclusive role. It's a pretty powerless role to be vice president, and then he wouldn't be there in New York bugging everybody else. So Teddy actually did agree to it. He ran with William McKinley, and they actually won. So now Teddy Roosevelt was vice president. At a very, very young age, might I add. They had won the presidency role by running on a platform of peace, prosperity, and conservation. And after they won, it wasn't long before, unfortunately, William McKinley, the President of the United States, was assassinated. And to the chagrin of everyone in New York, all of a sudden, Theodore Roosevelt was President of the United States, the youngest president ever at that time at 42 years old. So that plan had really backfired on the Republicans in New York. Now, obviously, Teddy Roosevelt at that time was a Republican, but he was much more progressive. He led a progressive movement because he was always more about the people versus corporations making a lot of money. He always sided with the labor side versus the big, company side. So when he got in there, he definitely put to work what he had ran on. He definitely wasn't just talking the talk. He was walking the walk. So, he championed average citizen fairness. Like I said, he continued to break up trust and regulating all of the collusion that was going on within those corporations. He regulated the railroads because they were monopolizing all of the West. And a big thing that he was really proud of, there had been a book written by a gentleman who was in New York and had worked in the meatpacking industry. And that book called The Jungle had really given people an insight into how bad the labor conditions were for these workers. Teddy read that book and immediately took action. So he made sure that there was hygiene in there were sinks, people were washing their hands, there weren't toilets in there before. He made sure that was a thing. He gave them, decent working hours. And he also passed the Pure Food and Drug Act to make sure that things were properly labeled, things were properly stored, and that the food and that the medicine that was going to be out to the consumers were going to be able to be safe and, relied upon and trusted. This guy had a big hand in everything. He was really the first president that had taken on, the sentiment of we're a world power and it is our responsibility to try to bring peace between everybody. So there was a big Japanese and Russian battle going on, and it was really going to have bad effects on everybody in the world. He had convinced them to come down to a convention in New Hampshire and actually brokered a deal between them and prevented them from going to war. He was the first president to get involved with something of that nature, and he actually ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize for being able to garner peace between the two nations. Another thing, he was the one that had kicked off and signed into effect the Panama Canal. So it was a way for the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean to be able to link up quicker, to be able to have his naval fleet be more powerful, to respond if need be, and also for commerce reasons as well. So it was a good business move, and it was a good move for the nation as well. So one of my favorite parts about Teddy Roosevelt was his love for nature and the outdoors. That never left him from his childhood until the day that he passed. He obviously understood the importance and the significance of the industrial period that was going on at that time with the railroads and the manufacturing plants and so forth. But he, really quickly recognized the potential damage that could be done as well and losing some really pristine and beautiful wonders of nature that were out there. And so he had signed into law the Antiquities Act. And so that allowed him to pretty much sanction off areas that he deemed, sacred, where you were not allowed to build there, and pretty much it led to all these national parks and monuments. He founded the National Forest Service to make sure that the forests were being taken care of and protected as well. So by the end of his presidency, he had mapped out 230 million acres worth of land that were to be preserved forever. So whenever you go to a state park or a national park, you go to the Grand Canyon, that was one of them. That is because of Teddy Roosevelt. And that was a wonderful, wonderful act of foresight for him to be able to see that far ahead. So Teddy had ran, obviously, a first term, but it was a little bit shorter because he had became the president, after William McKinley was assassinated. But when he got reelected, he was reelected at the biggest margin ever up to that point. The public loved him because he just got stuff done. He had declared that that was considered his second term and that he wasn't going to run after that, even though the law allowed him to, at the time, continue running if he wanted to. He would later regret that, but he had groomed William Howard Taft, his Secretary of War, to become the eventual president, and it did work. So Taft became the president, and Theodore Roosevelt had taken a backseat and started traveling and going on these big expeditions. He was actually sponsored by National Geographic and a couple other institutions to go, into the Amazon and go to these other countries and to charter out land and to discover new species and hunt and bring all of these artifacts and animals home for scientific study. He played a big role in that time of learning more about nature and biology and geography. So all of the beliefs and all of the policies that Teddy Roosevelt had stood behind during his presidency, surprisingly, Taft was the opposite. As a Republican, he was way more conservative and was much more about giving money to corporations and overlooking corruption and collusions and things of that nature. And Teddy really, it wasn't in his jurisdiction to do so, but he did not trust Taft as president and thought that it was going to be harmful to the nation. So he actually ran in 1912 for president again under the Republican Party against Taft. He had actually lost in the primaries to Taft, and so Teddy Roosevelt said, well, the only thing that I can do is run as a third-party candidate. It was later called the Bull Moose Party, and he was the first president to run in a third party. And he actually ended up beating Taft. He got in second, and Woodrow Wilson became president, but he had somehow corralled and mobilized all of the citizens, to vote for him, and he had beaten out Taft, which was a pretty big deal. So after that, Roosevelt really just traveled a lot and hunted and read a lot of books. He had a photographic memory, and he could read up to like 4 or 5 books a day, I heard. He was a speed reader. He was just a very, very intelligent dude, and now that he wasn't president, he was able to put all that stuff into practice. He ended up writing over his career like 38 books. He had always been like a guest writer on magazines and editorials and stuff of that nature. And he would occasionally go out and campaign for other politicians and, people that were nominated that he had supported as well. But mostly he was out in the wilderness hunting, discovering, exploring, doing scientific research, stuff of that nature. Roosevelt had actually got a little bit bored later in life and was actually a little bit worried about the citizens of America with what the presidents were doing. And he actually started to run for the presidential election of 1920. Unfortunately, he died in 1919, so he wasn't able to see that through and potentially get a third term. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why I love Teddy Roosevelt so much. I had read a biography on him probably like 4 or 5 years ago just because I love history. I'm a huge history buff, specifically U.S. history. I love like the colonial times, revolutionary times, the Manifest Destiny, the Gold Rush, all that, World War I, Great Depression. I love all that stuff. And Teddy Roosevelt, man, I read this book and I was so blown away by this guy. I mean, presidents now are typically politicians their whole life. Teddy Roosevelt was so much more than that. They really broke the mold after him. He just lived like 10 lives, really, when you look at it. So this dude was an American statesman, obviously. He was a politician. He was a conservationist. He was a naturalist. He was definitely a writer. He was the 26th president, obviously. He was the vice president. He was the governor of New York. He was the assistant secretary in the Navy. He was the president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners. He was a minority leader. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, as I said. He was a self-taught zoologist. He was a boxer, and he is the only president to win the Medal of Honor. It was posthumously after he died. The only president to do so. This dude was so multifaceted and was such a go-getter and had so many obstacles early on, but had overcame it. He came from a family of wealth, but he never rested on those laurels, and he took full advantage of the opportunities that were given to him and rose well above those standards. What I love most about Teddy Roosevelt, I loved his energy. Everyone said he was just always on the move. He worked out every single day, even in his presidency. He would walk like 20 miles a day, legit. He would swim in the Potomac River, sometime nude. The guy was just nonstop. He would read somehow 5 books every day. He fit all of this in while he was administrating the role of the president. It's pretty insane to fathom. And the guy was just driven, man. He was focused. He always knew what he wanted to accomplish, and he would do anything to get that, even if it was going against the grain of his colleagues around him. He never cared what his colleagues thought of him. He always did what he thought was the right thing and what was right for the people. Again, so he was fearless. He was never afraid to do that kind of stuff. He always walked with integrity. He always did what was the right thing, even when no one was looking. He never cared about the party that he was in. He always said he was a Republican, but really he would tell, his contemporaries and his close loved ones around him that he really didn't care what party he was in. He would just always try to do the right thing, which is something you do not see anymore. You just don't. Definitely a commendable thing. And he was intelligent. He had a photographic intelligence. The dude was, obviously we know him as a tough guy. That's what everyone knows about Teddy Roosevelt. This tough, fearless boxer. The guy that, so he actually, while he was president, he boxed his whole life, and he would still spar while he was president, and he would spar with amateur boxers, and he would spar with other politicians. He sparred with a soldier, and the soldier hit him in the eye and damaged his left retina, and he was actually nearly blind in his left eye, pretty much blind for the rest of his life. I didn't know that. Another thing about Teddy Roosevelt, so when he was running later in life, so after he had served his first 2 terms as president, he was on the campaign trail and he actually got shot, and he got shot in the chest. Luckily, he had a steel eyeglass frame in his pocket as well as his little speech folded up. And so the bullet slowed down and it just lodged into his muscle. So because he knew so much about biology from always studying and dissecting animals and the taxidermy, he wasn't coughing up blood, so he knew that it hadn't gotten to his lungs, so he knew that he was okay. And so he wouldn't let anyone do any medical procedures on him, and he still did his speech for 90 more minutes. This is crazy stuff that just would never happen today. And then later, after the speech, when he finally allowed people to, take a look at him medically, they found out that while it wasn't that damaging of a shot, it was still too close to the heart to, try to take it out. And so he had lived with that bullet in him for the rest of his life. He was just a tough as nails dude, but what I loved most about him is that he just appropriately balanced the toughness with the tenderness as well, with how he just cared about the common man. And he was always a family man through and through. He always made time to spend with his kids, being the avid reader that he was and such a good listener. I love that perfect balance that he had. That saying that, he's known so well for, speak softly but carry a large stick. So really, what that meant to him, and at least what it means to me, is, you don't have to always yell and stuff to get what you want, to motivate people, but make sure that you have the arsenal and the big stick to show people that you are about it if need be. And so that's why he always had a big naval fleet. He knew that if he could control the oceans, he could always be a big player in the world. And he was really like the first foreign policy type president. I love how he overcame his health deficiencies early on. He accepted every challenge that he had head on, and he always overcame those odds. He never doubted himself, which I really respect. Obviously, as we know, he came from an esteemed, well-to-do family, but he identified more with those Western-type people. No one could hold that against him, that he was just a yuppie, a kid of money. He was tough, and he could always back it up. I love that he'd been in the politics and went over to the West Side to try to be that Westerner that he always admired and loved. Just that fearlessness again. I love that so much about him. how he was able to write a book in college while doing studies. Never influenced by his colleagues, always doing the right thing. I've pretty much said everything I feel here. Never was his intent to do right by his party. It was always to do right by the people. That is pretty much all I got on the dude. I mean, when you look at everything that he accomplished and everything that he was, that's just something that, like I said, you just do not see anymore. The dude was just so multifaceted and so versatile in everything that he did. It's almost inhuman to see what he did and the kind of life that he lived. He did all of that in 60 years, which is just mind-boggling to think about. He should set the tone for every president, every politician, every person with how they live their life, and just always striving for the best. And no matter what obstacles or deficiencies you inherit, you always try to overcome that and keep applying pressure and pushing through it. That's what Teddy Roosevelt always did. He always respected being well-read and always knowing a lot about the subject at hand, but he always walked being humble. He always had humility, and he was always able somehow to ruffle feathers with people, and to anger his colleagues because he was so much about integrity. But in the end, he was always able to be the peacemaker and to bring everyone together and mobilize people to understand his ideas. Having that charisma and that soft touch is something that you can't really pinpoint. I don't even know if it's something that you can teach, but that dude had it. The fact that he had all of that at his fingertips and he never got corrupted with the power is just so commendable. He is pretty much undisputably regarded as one of the top 5 presidents of all time. I mean, there's a reason in 1920 when Mount Rushmore was erected, he was one of 4 presidents on there, not even 2 decades after he had left the office. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt, for a reason. He got so much done in that time. He was progressive beyond his years, It is just not enough to put into words what this guy accomplished, and I admire him so much. I've studied a lot of presidents, and I can't find a president that was so interesting and had so much substance and had so much life within him like Teddy Roosevelt. He was obviously the uncle of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the one who had the New Deal, the one who, was polio and had handicapped and was in a wheelchair. And a lot of the things that Roosevelt did to pull him out of the depression of the time was some of the stuff that he had witnessed his uncle Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, do. He had a lasting impact on people. He is my favorite president, I would say. Hard to say if he's the best one. I'm not one to speak on that, but he is my favorite president of all time. And that's really all I got, guys. I love talking about history. I love learning about history. I think it's important that we learn from our past so we don't repeat our mistakes in the future. Thank you for watching, everybody. I hope everyone's having a good week. We're halfway through it. I hope we all finish strong and push forth to persevere and accomplish our goals. I love you guys for always tuning in and engaging with me. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel, as well as share this as well. I love you guys. We're going to catch you on Friday. It is time to plug out. Deuces.